Today we are going to be making the Calvin crop, which is a super exciting collaboration pattern that I made with Evan. I will have him linked on the screen so you can check out his Instagram. He's a fantastic designer. He designed this top and I helped bring it to fruition in the form of a pattern so that you guys can make it as well. The pattern is a great scrap busting project, so I highly recommend that you use scraps if you have them lying around. It's also amazing because you do not need a serger. It's completely lined and bias bound and it looks beautiful on the inside and the outside. This pattern comes with print-at-home, large format, and projector files, so you have a variety of options to choose from based on your needs. Here, I'm piecing together the print-at-home pattern, which is a total of 14 pages. When printing, I highly recommend using Google Chrome because the images show up in the upper left-hand corner of the page. That means you can piece together the entire pattern without having to trim off any of the edges. Next, we'll cut out all of our paper pattern pieces, as well as our fabric and our interfacing. Please note that I highly recommend using fabric that has a bit of give, such as a linen or a suiting fabric. If you choose a fabric with too stiff of a weave, such as a quilting cotton, your bias binding won't stretch enough and may cause tightness around the armhole later on. In the same vein, I also recommend making your bias tape out of your self fabric instead of buying pre-made bias tape. This is because the pre-made stuff simply doesn't have enough stretch. Once all of our pieces are cut out, we're going to interface the wrong side of the underbust center front lining and the underbust side front lining. To properly adhere the interfacing, make sure that you press and hold for at least 10 to 15 seconds on each piece. After the pieces are prepared, we're going to place the underbust side front on top of the underbust center front with right sides together. I like to use clips instead of pins for this project, but feel free to use whatever you have on hand. Then we're going to sew the seams together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, being sure to apply this step to both the main fabric and the lining fabric. Here's what the pattern pieces should look like when they're done, and now we're simply going to press those seams open so that they lay nice and flat when you're wearing the garment. Now we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches between the notches on the bodice front pattern piece. One row will be at 1/4 inch seam allowance and the other row will be at 3/8 inch seam allowance. A basting stitch is just a row of stitches with a long stitch length. When you're sewing these rows, be sure to leave a long tail on both ends and do not backstitch. Once all of our basting stitches are in, we're going to tie off the ends of one side and trim away the excess so that it doesn't get in our way. Next, we're going to gather our stitches to be the same length as the notches on our underbust pattern pieces. To do this, I like to pin the notches together before gathering the fabric. This helps ensure that the gathers are evenly distributed. Once the notches are pinned, gently pull on the long threads that are on the top until the fabric is nicely gathered. Then we're going to ease the rest of the fabric together and pin it in place. Once prepared, it's time to sew all of the pieces together with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Sewing 2 curves together can be a bit tricky, so I recommend going slow with this step. I also personally prefer to have the gathered side on the top because I feel like it's easier to manage. Now that those pieces are together, we're going to do the exact same steps to attach the lining and sandwich the bodice front. We're just going to pin and ease the pieces together and sew them at 1/2 inch seam allowance. When sewing, I prefer to sew directly on top of the previous stitch line that was made, so to do this, you'll want the lining to be closest to your bobbin and your main fabric to be on top. Next, we're going to take our scissors and trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. Take care when you're trimming so that you don't accidentally cut into the good part of your garment. Once the seam allowance is trimmed, flip the garment so that the seam allowance is hidden in between the outer and lining layers of the fabric. Then we'll press the seam so that it's nice and crisp. When doing this, I prefer to use a pressing ham because it offers a really nice shape for the bust cup. Then we're going to top stitch 3/8 inch away from the seam, which will fully encapsulate the raw seam allowance on the inside. Next up, it's time to take our bodice back pieces and lay them on top of our bodice front with right sides together. We'll pin or clip them in place and sew them both at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once that's done, it's time to finish the side seams. To do this, we'll fold the seam allowance in half towards the bodice back, and then we'll fold and press it once more so that the raw edge is fully enclosed by the seam allowance. Then we'll top stitch the seam allowance in place. If you find that this is difficult due to the weight of your fabric, you can also opt to serge this seam or to bind it with bias tape. After top stitching the side seam, it should look beautiful on both the inside and the outside. Now it's time to work on the back. We're going to hem the center back seams. With the wrong side of the fabric facing up, turn and press the raw edges of the bodice back pieces over by 1/4 of an inch twice to create a rolled edge. Then top stitch that edge in place. Now that the majority of the garment is constructed, all we have left to do is add the bias binding. I'm going to show you how to press the pattern pieces once, and then you're going to do this on all the binding pieces moving forward. We'll start with our front top binding. Fold and press the binding in half lengthwise. Then fold and press the outer edges in half again to meet each other in the middle. Once all these folds are nicely pressed in place, you now have bias tape. Now with right sides together, pin the front top binding to the bodice front. Sew along the top edge with a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance. This basically means that you want to sew with about a hair less than 3/8 of an inch. Once that seam is sewn, we're going to fold the binding over the raw edge using our creases as a guide. Then we'll pin it in place, making sure that the folded edge just barely covers the stitch line. Next, we'll top stitch the binding in place from the right side of the garment. Now that the edge is bound, we're going to do the same technique to the back binding. The only difference is that we will be overlapping the back bodice pieces by 1/2 of an inch at the center top before attaching the binding. Then we'll simply walk through all of those same steps of sewing the binding on at 3/8 of an inch, folding it over the binding, and then top stitching it in place. Next up, it's time for the armhole bindings. Take both armhole binding pattern pieces and fold them in half lengthwise, then sew the short ends at 3/8 of an inch to make one continuous loop. Now we're going to pin the binding to the armhole. First, you need to match up your notches. The front notch aligns with the top of the bodice front. The back notch aligns with the top of the bodice back, and the seam allowance of the armband aligns with the notch on the armhole that's located on the bodice back just beyond the side seam. After those are all pinned, you're going to ease the binding in place. There's about 1 centimeter of easing at the front and 1 centimeter of easing at the back. This is necessary for the binding to hug the side of your bust. Then just like before, we're going to sew the binding to the garment with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to fold the binding over and pin or clip it in place. I like to clip heavily through this section to make sure that the binding eases beautifully onto the garment. Once all the clips are in place, we're going to top stitch the armband on. I prefer to start and stop my stitching at the top of the armband, but you can also start wherever else you'd like. Be sure to do this to both armbands, and then we're ready for the final steps. To finish off the garment, take both waist binding pieces. Align one short end of each piece and sew them together with 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. Then you'll want to press your binding the same way that we did the previous bias tape, but also be sure to press the seam allowance open where the two long pieces meet. Next, we're going to sew both short edges of the waistband binding together and flip them so that the raw edge is on the inside. Now it's finally time to attach the last binding piece to the garment. Start by aligning the center seam of the waist binding to the underbust center front. Beginning from the center, pin or clip outwards along the raw edge of the garment. The excess at each end will become your ties. Next, sew the binding on with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and proceed with folding and pinning the binding over the raw edge and top stitching it down all the way from one end to the other, just the same way we've done with all the other bindings. Alright, it's officially time to celebrate because your Calvin crop is finished. I hope you enjoyed making this garment as much as Evan and I enjoyed creating the pattern for you. It was truly a labor of love and wouldn't have been possible without all 33 of our amazing testers. We were lucky to receive lots of valuable feedback throughout the testing process, which helped enhance both the instructions and the garment itself. We couldn't be more thankful to them, and we're so appreciative of your support as well. Thanks so much for being here, and I will see you in the next one.